Kia ora koutou, welcome to this Building a Neuro-Inclusive School Cafe session recording for you, talking about calm versus chaos, building a more regulated classroom environment to suit your neurodivergent learners. This is a recording of a cafe session that we've had. So that if you weren't able to come along and chat with us on the day, you can still catch up on some great ideas. Welcome. Karakia as we begin. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tu, te mauri ora, ki te kātua, homie, hui, tai kie. A lovely karakia, bringing people together from all of the places to be strong together. I am Madeleine Armstrong-Wilcox. I'm the head of programs here at the Neurodiversity in Education Project. Welcome. So today in this cafe session, we're going to talk about why dysregulation might happen for our neurodivergent learners, because understanding that why helps us to then work out, well, okay, how do we support learners? How do we build a classroom that is more regulating in and of itself? How do we build our neuro-inclusive classrooms? We're going to talk about what dysregulation is not and share some strategies and support you to set your own goal around building regulation into your whole classroom. Okay, in a nutshell, although there are various things that we could look at as triggers for dysregulation or dysregulated behavior in a particular learner, we can say as a broad brush idea that dysregulation happens when there is a mismatch between what's going on for someone, their brain-based differences, if we're talking about our neurodivergent learners, and what is happening in their environment. That's all it comes down to, that mismatch between what's happening and what's happening around a learner. They're not lining up, they're not matching, they're not supporting each other. Really, really simple. Lots in there to unpack though. So let's dig a little bit deeper and look at some of those brain-based differences for our neurodivergent learners that are going to have an impact on their ability to regulate. Okay, so first and foremost, and this is what our neurodivergent learners are telling us so loud and clear, that the sensory environment of a classroom and a school makes an enormous difference on their ability to function in that environment. Wouldn't it be nice if we could instantly change that sensory environment to suit everyone? Unfortunately, it's a little more complicated than that, because for some of our neurodivergent learners, and at some times, so things change, across the day and between learners, they're receiving too much sensory input. So that's when our classrooms are too loud, too hot, too visually overwhelming. There is just too much input for that brain to process and deal with, on top of all of the other things that are going on in that brain. Remember, our classrooms are environments for learning. First and foremost, got my teacher hat on there really firmly. When those brains are tied up, busy with trying to process a lot of sensory input, you can see there's no room left for learning or for regulating at that really basic level. So that too muchness of the sensory input can make a big difference. Conversely, however, some of the brain-based differences of our neurodivergent learners, I mean, their brains are receiving too little sensory stimulation for their brains to be active and alert and happy. And that is, for instance, some of our learners with ADHD may have brains that need a lot of sensory input to be awake and firing and really rocking and rolling. So in that instance, maybe they're sat still for a long time. They're not receiving the input that their bodies need, their brains need to be able to go. So too much or too little, and it's quite hard to tease out those differences between individual learners, but it's just worth us knowing that sometimes it's too much for some learners and sometimes it's too little for others. So we need some really global strategies rather than individualized ones. And sometimes the sensory input can just be wrong for a particular learner, for instance. And I think sometimes as teachers, we can get this wrong really easily. For instance, fidgets. So sometimes fidgets have a rough texture, the ones you can buy in the shop. Sometimes they have a smooth texture. Sometimes they have an icky, sticky texture. And if a learner is sitting and using a fidget, but that sensory input feels just wrong to them, it's going to be really disruptive for their regulation. So if they are seeking a smooth texture, but they are receiving an icky, sticky texture, their brain's going to be really consumed with that wrong sensory input, leaving no space left for regulating, let alone learning. And then we have our neurodivergent learners that just have, for instance, a diagnosed sensory processing disorder, or it can just be differences where the sensory processing is not dealing with that information in an expected way. So that can be an additional challenge related to those sensory systems. Okay, relating to brain-based differences around thinking, around the intellect, for some of our neurodivergent learners, if we imagine their intellectual processing part of their brain and their emotional processing part of their brain, those two are literally wired together very tightly, so that thinking doesn't happen without feeling, and feeling doesn't happen without thinking it through as well. The emotional and the intellectual are really tightly wed together. So you imagine in a very busy, very young brain, maybe where there's lots of fascinating thinking and learning going on. At the same time, there's a lot of emotions going on as well. So that intellectual processing and emotional processing is running really fast and really hot, leaving perhaps limited space to regulate, to dial down those emotions sometimes, to learn to manage those emotions, to pay attention to what else is going on around them. Because when things are really fun in your own head, there may not be a greater space to notice the social environment, perhaps. So when the emotions and the intellect are tightly tied together, you can expect a lot more high emotions. Leading on from that is this idea of intensity. We'll come to that and unpack that a little bit more in a minute. And one of the other key brain-based differences is just as simple as developmental differences. For instance, in a gifted brain, there's a process of pruning of connections that happens in a non-gifted brain in those adolescent years, where extra stuff is just kind of pruned out, extra connections are gone, things just start settling down in the actual neurological development of the brain. In our gifted brain, that happens much later, which means that brains are less well organized, less well structured until perhaps late teens. So there's quite a big developmental difference going on there. Another example is just simply lagging skills, that our smaller, younger learners simply haven't had time to learn skills to regulate, right? We just can call that lagging skills, but we can also call it just being young. Anecdotally, and I'm really interested in people's feedback about this and other people's anecdotal observations. We're noticing a really high number of, or disproportionate number of much younger learners presenting with more dysregulation, if that makes sense. So the demand for services seems to be greater in younger learners than in previous years. So really interested to see if that matches other people's observations and some working theories around that. Anyway, this idea of intensity and how this impacts on our neurodivergent learners and often in particular our gifted learners. This can link to intense emotions where emotions are just more fine-grained. For instance, I was chatting with a learner last week who said, I was feeling a cross between frustrated and annoyed, but also really confused at the same time. And I don't know the word for that. It's somewhere in the middle of all of those things. So it's quite a high degree of nuance in those feelings. And the emotions are often more complex, not as simple as some of our basic or universal emotions. In keeping with the Olympic spirit, often those intense emotions come on faster, they stronger, they are more, if you have a Richter scale of emotions, they're more at the high end and they stay around for longer. Those big emotions can be quite a thing for many of our neurodivergent learners. We can also see that many of our neurodivergent learners have a stronger memory for emotions. So for instance, I was talking with one learner who explained to me that she felt like she must have a peculiar form of amnesia because she could remember feelings, these particular and intense and not very pleasant feelings around something that happened. But she couldn't remember the thing that happened. So she was struggling to kind of move past those particular, not very pleasant emotions because she couldn't remember what had happened to trigger those emotions. Now, from a teacher's perspective, that's fascinating and also frustrating, because often our instinctive approach is after we notice a child has become dysregulated and we get them back into a regulated state and we go back and we have a little chat with them afterwards. What's going on there? How are you doing? And if you'd asked that child, she would have said, no idea. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what I was thinking. I just know what I was feeling. Quite a hard situation to then try and untangle. We also see neurodivergent learners who have a stronger bodily response to their emotions, and that is tightly tied into those sensory systems and that sensory processing that we were talking about before, where emotions are felt and held and stored and expressed through those bodily responses. And we have neurodivergent learners, and I'm just going to highlight in particular autistic learners that can be more sensitive to their own emotions and more sensitive to other people's emotions. It's a common misconception that people with autism are somehow emotion blind or that they lack empathy, so they must have low sensitivity to emotions. It's not actually the case at all. That is a stereotype, is a misconception. Often our neurodivergent learners can observe other people's emotions and be so sensitive and empathetic towards those emotions that they actually kind of soak them in themselves and respond in turn. Rather than being less empathetic or less sensitive to other people's emotions. Often it's the other way around. It's more. It may just be that what we typically expect of an emotional or empathetic response is different from what we are seeing. So just to bear in mind. Okay, dysregulation is not a choice. It is a response to that mismatch between what's going on in someone's brain and what's happening in the environment. It is not a behavioral choice. Dysregulation is not being too much, too loud, too naughty, too anything. It's not an overreaction and it's not oversensitivity. In fact, if you talk to a learner after they experienced some dysregulation, said, oh, you were just really overreacting, that's not going to be a helpful statement. It is not an overreaction. It's simply a response to not being able to manage in that environment. It's also not immaturity. I will say that with a caveat, though, that our younger learners may not have had time enough on the planet to be able to develop skills for regulation. So we do need to think carefully about that one, that actually it may be a sign if you're thinking, oh, this person's just super immature and their responses are really babyish. Maybe they haven't had the opportunity to learn particular skills. So it's not a problem in that person. They're not just babyish or immature. It's a problem that they haven't encountered some learning about being able to regulate yet. Just flips that a little bit more. Dysregulation is not a reflection of poor parenting. It's not something that you can fix through a parenting course. Dysregulation is not a reflection of other abilities. So you wouldn't, for instance, say, well, you know, here's this gifted kid, but they can't be gifted because they're crying all the time. That's not a reflection of a high intellect. Well, could well be. So it isn't linked to ability, but also experiencing dysregulation is not a permanent state of affairs. It's not unchangeable. It's not something that we can't support. There's a lot of negatives in there. To rephrase that, a child experiencing dysregulated states is something as teachers we can actually have input into, we can make changes, and we can support greater regulation for that child. So not permanent. Okay, again to this key point that dysregulated states are a lack of match between what's going on in someone's brain and also the things that they have learned that can support their regulation in the environment that they are in. So being teachers, we're talking about classrooms and schools. When all of those things line up and match really well, Bob's your uncle. We should get through things in a really nicely regulated way. But when one of those is not working, then that's where we might see some dysregulation happen. Okay. In our live cafe session, we talked about the things that teachers have noticed, and I'll just highlight some of those things and see if it resonates with your experience. So, greater dysregulation during transition time, start of day, end of day in particular. During break times or start and end of break times. So the outdoor play environment is a very loose, unstructured, one might even say chaotic environment. It's noisy, it's active, it's busy. Dysregulation during break times or in moving back into a classroom can be a real trigger for dysregulation. We've also noticed that very fast, seems very fast to us as outsiders, that very fast flip between a regulated state and a dysregulated state. And I'll really stress that seems like it probably wasn't for that child. And when it's that Coca-Cola bottle analogy that you shake the bottle a little bit and nothing happens and nothing happens and nothing happens. And we can't notice that build up. But one small thing lets everything out. So it's probably our noticing rather than what's happening in that child. One of the other things to point out is that sometimes as teachers, we do focus on a single child. This child is becoming dysregulated. This child is causing a problem. This child has a problem, etc. If we go back into this idea here, we need to look at this aspect, the classroom and the school environment, and think about our classroom as being a regulation tool, and our classroom and school obviously being the site of regulation. So we focus on changing the classroom and the school environment rather than changing the brain-based differences, because that we won't change that. That's not a winning option. Changing here in the classroom and school environment, and changing here in the strategies that we can teach, and we teach everyone, not one child, that's where we can get some real traction. So focusing on the one child and how we regulate the one child may lead us down a track that's not really going to ultimately be a win. We focus on the classroom environment, the school environment, and the strategies that we can teach everyone. Okay, so just quickly, did any of those resonate for you? And for you, what would you add around what you notice in regulation or dysregulation in the learners that you work with? So what can we do? Let's look at 3 things that are easy to think through and easy to put in place straight away. Number 1, the most important thing is we as teachers set the tone for a regulated environment. It's absolutely essential that as teachers we absolutely upfront with this. We are in charge of setting a regulated environment. We make the difference. So some ideas for that regulated environment that we are in charge of and we create and we maintain. Having a classroom that is calm and quiet and has predictable routines with some flex, obviously, because we're not running, Victorian style classrooms. We're running modern classrooms, but they need to be predictable. We need to be really conscious of bringing in randomness and change and things like that. That's not going to work for our neurodivergent learners. Setting that environment as a one that is calm and quiet and predictable is absolutely essential. Taking a sensory stock take, and really soon we can have a guide for how to do that up on our website, is so important. Doing it just yourself, asking a colleague to come and do it. You know how you kind of don't see your own mess when you're at home? Similar situation in your classroom, you may not notice. But a sensory stock take will guide you through the visual environment, the tactile environment, the sound environment, all of those things. So you can get a good gauge on what it's like. If you have older, actually scratch that, any age of learners, you can involve them in that stock take. So for very young learners, you might just, as a whole class discussion for moments, not for hours, but for, a few minutes, what do you notice about the sounds in this classroom? And just get them talking through it, thinking through it, get them to notice the sensory environment and tell you about their experiences of that environment. For older learners, you can actually say, right, let's go and all think about XYZ in the sensory stock take. I want you to do a stock take and you report back to me about what you have found out. So you can take it chunk at a time. And for much older learners, you can just say, right, here is an entire sensory stock take. Work through this. Tell me what you're experiencing. It's tuning in to your students' experience of the sensory environment of your classroom is super, super important so that you get a handle on what's going on. Equally so, take an emotional stocktake. Now, this is a little bit more complex. There's no checklist that guides you through this, unfortunately. I wish there was. It's actually you and your emotional intelligence, and for older students, them and their emotional intelligence. Just sitting back at various points, you might pick a week and you might pick 10 random moments across that week. Just sit back and go, okay, what's the emotional tone in here right now? Are there people with really high emotions right now? What's the overall vibe going on right now? And just do that repeatedly over time. Do it with your older learners. You can ask them to do that as well. And then put that information together and think, what's the overriding emotional tone in here? Is it high? Is it super excited, which is great, but maybe a little overwhelming? Is it calm? Is it bored? Is it dull? Just actually try and pull out the overriding emotional tone for the whole group, and then think about some individuals as well. So getting yourself tuned into the emotional life of your classroom, super important. Visual timetable, I cannot stress how important this is for our neurodivergent learners to literally have old-fashioned teaching style visual timetable on the board for everyone, not just Johnny, here's your special timetable, but there's a visual timetable. It's left on the board. It's for everyone. By visual, let's get really clear. It means little pictures and simple words, right? Not just words and not just pictures on their own. So a little bit of both, tailored to your age group. Obviously, you're not going to have cutesy little comic pictures for your older learners, but you might have icons. They might design the icons. But that visual timetable is on the board and you stick to it. Okay. Change can be incredibly discombobulating for our neurodivergent learners. So it's the kind of thing you need to signal well in advance and the reasons for change well in advance. Now, I know schools, things happen and, all sorts of random things happen at random times. But if we set up our visual timetable as the expectation and we're able to signal change clearly and calmly, that incredibly supports that regulated tone. It builds this predictability, which means that we don't have to always be thinking and always be on high alert for change for our neurodivergent learners, because that uses up mental resources that could be going into regulation. Okay. When we have been talking with neurodivergent learners of all ages and their families and their supporters, one of the things, apart from the sensory environment, one of the other things that's come through really loud and clear is the need for structure and clarity in their learning environments. So this can be as simple as a structured classroom where the reading books are labelled and in one place and they don't wander about the classroom, and the pencils are in one place and they're labelled and they don't wander about the classroom. So very simple things like that, through to structure and clarity in the actual lessons, so that a lesson runs in a similar way most of the time. There isn't some great surprise change. For older learners, the content of their learning is structured in a way that works. And just a heads up on that, our neurodivergent learners need the big picture first, not last. So rather than we're working on, some little details and some little details, and those details lead up to the big point, putting the point first, and then saying, right, now let's unpack the little details. That's a really supportive learning structure for our neurodivergent learners. Okay, one more thing that we can do that really easily sets the tone, and this comes into this idea of calm, that in your classroom, there are activities that are deliberately calming activities that are just part of your daily routine. And that might be good old-fashioned SSR as a calming activity, or a quiet transition activity between a high energy activity or between break time and something else, that there's time for some calm. So I know lots of teachers use music for various things in their classroom, like music during a transition or music during tidy up. We can flip that and use music during our calming times as well. Quieter, calming music. We also have deliberately calming and inviting, physically comfortable spaces as well. If you haven't seen our sensory retreat guide on our website, I highly recommend looking at that and thinking about how you can build a deliberately calm retreat space into every classroom, not just in the school, but in every classroom has a deliberately calm retreat built in. You can do it for cheap or free and really easily. So this strategy is all about being the teacher who is in charge of setting up a well-regulated classroom. In case you have not seen this gorgeous wee graphic that is available everywhere, this idea of co-regulation is so important, that we are the ones who bring the calm. We are it. So if we are feeling dysregulated as teachers, or tense, or wound up, reactive, we have to be very deliberate about not just creating the calm classroom, but creating the calm in ourselves. Super important. Okay. Once we have this environment that is set up for calm regulation, and it's all the environment is in place, we have set the tone, we've done the stock take, we've checked out the emotional zone, we have a beautifully structured, clear learning environment. Then we do some active teaching, right? We're really good at this as teachers. This is our thing. Sometimes it's a step we forget to take. Right, we have this lovely calm environment, but we forget to do active teaching. So active teaching of regulation, 3 things that are essential, and they are actually essential in this order. I think sometimes we jump into, let's teach a regulation skill, when actually kids aren't fluent in talking about their senses or their emotions or anything that's going on, right? We actually have to teach these things in order. So number 1, we can start with teaching about how our senses work, not just in that scientific biological way, but about how you feel when you're sitting in really bright sunlight, as opposed to how you feel when you're sitting in a dark room with a really small, gentle light. Do you feel different? So that's just a simple example, but teaching students about their own sensory responses, their own sensory preferences, that's where that sensory stock take can help, because it starts those conversations. And also teaching the language of emotions, deliberate teaching of emotional fluency past happy, sad, good, bad, whatever, into much more complicated, much more nuanced ideas, using perhaps zones of regulation as your starting point, not as the ending point, but as a starting point for that fluency. Kids and you need to have the language, the framework, this is stuff we talk about all the time, embedded. before you can talk about regulating your emotions, you have to understand what the heck emotions are anyway and how you name them, right? Super important. Step one. Step two is another form of fluency about our brains, right? Very, very important that kids can go, well, you know, my brain prefers quiet, or my brain prefers lots of action and movement. My brain prefers X, Y, Z. And understanding that those preferences change between situations and over time, and depending if you're extra tired or all of those different things. So understanding our own brain and preferences around it, but also understanding that every one of us lives in this classroom where there are lots of people. So it's great to know that your brain prefers lots of movement, but also knowing that that person over there, their brain prefers lots of stillness. We have to live together in the same classroom. How can we do that? Right? So understanding our own stuff and everyone's stuff is the next really important part. We recommend that you deliberately teach about brain preferences, and there are lots of different ways to do that. Our last cafe session introduced the Welcome to My Brain card set as one way that you can get people talking about brains. Those are available to buy on our website. Actually, I have a pack right here. They look like this, and we have free lesson plans coming soon on our website that guide you through, okay, well, how do I actually use this in an actual lesson in my classroom? And, you know, one and done in any of these things is not a really effective approach. So how do I build that over time to support learners? Okay, so first step, building fluency and talking about sensory processing, sensory information, and our emotions. Second step, understanding our own and other people's brain-based differences. Then we can get to, all right, how do we teach for regulation? Right? We can't just jump into teaching regulation strategies without that groundwork, because those strategies have nothing to fall back on. They have no why underpinning them. Okay. When I talk about teaching, it is really important that that's teaching like we do well as teachers, hands-on activities and multimodal, kids are engaged and interested and active. It's not just nagging. It's not just saying to kids, let's move into the green zone now. All right, that's just telling kids what to do. Let's really activate our great skills as teachers to teach strategies and skills. So how do we do that? Golden point and critical. So we do it all the time. This is absolutely essential business. So perhaps one lesson a week. I don't think that's often enough. Perhaps 10 minutes at the start of every day or before lunch every day, you do a little activity or a little quick check-in, right? It is little and often is much better than, okay, for 3 weeks, we're going to do a lesson a day about X, Y, Z, and then we're never going to think about it again. That's not a useful approach. Little and often, but also proactively. So just on the assumption that it's useful, important, if not essential, to support kids in their skills and strategies for being able to regulate well, we just do this proactively. We don't wait until there is that massive, massive problem that is increasingly hard to untangle. We're proactive, not reactive. And as teachers, we use great teaching strategies. That is not just telling kids. We play games. We have hands-on activities and hands-on resources. We do it through Lego and Play-Doh if we have little ones. We do it through discussion and role play and, really interesting things and action and movement and excitement. We do it using those great teaching strategies that we all have. We do it with everyone, as well as at times, as needed, peel away groups for a little bit of extra, a little bit of something different, a little bit of a particular strategy that you want to teach just for a few kids. Just like we do as great teachers anyway, we do things with the whole class and we do things just with particular groups. Okay, so we just remember our great strategies as effective teachers. But we start with the idea that we work as a whole class together on learning regulation skills. Okay, if you're like, well, where does this fit into the curriculum? Health and PE. And also literacy, you can angle it into your literacy lessons. You could probably, if you're very creative, angle it into your maths lessons somewhere as well. I'm not quite sure where. A bit more creative thinking on that one. But this is whole class and groups and all the time. We need to also remember that we're not using the teaching of regulation as a compliance activity or as a judgmental activity or something that's moralizing for kids, especially for our older ones who will pick up on a judgmental or compliance focus. That we are warmly accepting of all emotions and warmly accepting of all differences, just with the understanding that there are skills that we can learn that really help us coexist happily together in this space where we're calm and well regulated. All right. So there are so many great resources out there that you can use as part of your teaching of regulation strategies. You can use as part of teaching your emotional fluency or brain-based differences. Here is a very random selection that we've pulled together very quickly, but on our website, you're going to find two really specific book lists that we really recommend. We put together with neurodivergent young people. So one book list that you'll find is books that celebrate neurodiversity. So books that really zoom in on brain-based differences and tell stories about differently wired kids without being moralizing or judgmental, or they're not social stories as well. Johnny has ADHD. Here's Johnny's medication. He takes it every day. None of that zone, but instead they're really celebratory stories with neurodivergent characters. Another book list we put together is more specific learning about neurodiversity. Some of the books that we might use in a more targeted way that support older learners and maybe parents to really think through what we're talking about when we're talking about neurodiversity. So plenty of resources out there. Another set of resources is hands-on cards that really support that building of fluency. So we've got here some from Innovative Resources. They come out of Australia with various zones, various emotions, but building that fluency. We have a similar set of cards that have come out of the Youth Enterprise Scheme, made by neurodivergent learners and specifically for New Zealand. They're called the Pukare cards. Thoroughly recommend them. And of course, the cards that we have developed at the whoopsie daisy, neurodiversity in education project, the welcome to my brain cards. So you're going to be able to see those on our website as well. Okay. And again, with the how, we remember our great strategies as really effective teachers. It's so useful to teach students simple routines. When I, then I is a really simple routine to teach. It's eminently flexible and changeable, and kids can personalize and adapt. When I feel this way, I can do this. When I notice whatever happening around me, I know I can go and do this, right? Put the power back into children's hands and extend that into not just I, but we. When we notice the emotional tone changing, we can XYZ. When we notice a group of kids doing this particular thing, then we can, right? That builds that collective spirit as well. As with any strategy teaching, you can model a strategy, you can get kids to test it out. Does that work for you? You can get them to practice it in structured situations like role play situations, or practice it, right, over this lunchtime, go and practice this thing we've been talking about. Come back and tell us about it. Encouraging adaptation of the strategies that you might be teaching. And then there's an idea that the I do, we do, you do structure, but thinking about that from a regulation focus. So thinking about, I'm the teacher in charge of regulation, I will regulate this room. We are the class in charge of regulation, we are going to all regulate together. You are in charge of your own regulation, you are going to. So it's adapting that little structure, I do, we do, you do, into ideas about regulation, but thinking about lots of that we. How do we do this collectively? What is it we do over and over that supports our regulation over and over? So a bunch of strategies there. So now what I'm really interested in, depends on when you're viewing this, of course, but what will you try out? Which of those three big picture ideas will you try out? So remember, the first one was you set the tone. You're in charge of creating the environment. The second one was, remember, you need to do some active teaching, right? So that active teaching, little and often, really proactively, not reactively, whole class as well as a small group, and teaching in order from fluency and understanding our senses and our emotions, understanding our brain-based differences, and then strategizing around those things. What would you like to try out? Make yourself a little goal. I'm going to try XYZ. I'm going to do it when, right? Actually commit yourself to a when. I'm going to try this every day next week. I'm going to try doing a sensory stock take in week 3, and I'm going to bring in a buddy, and I'm going to do it with kids, right? So flesh out your when and your how. And then think about how you might work out how that went. What are you expecting to notice? And then after you've tried it out, what did you actually notice? And what will you try out next? All right. So what might you try, when and how, and what are you expecting to happen? And looping back, what did actually happen? Give those things a go. Okay. Very quick karakia to close. Kia tau to rangi Māori e ki runga inga iwi o te ao. Peace be to all of you. I hope that you have picked up a couple of strategies you might try out in your more neuro-inclusive classroom. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for spending time. Bye-bye.